Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Larchmont Public Library, Washington Irving, and myself, your friendly, retired, not quite local librarian, Frank, welcome to The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river dominated by the ancient Dutch navigators called the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port, which is sometimes called Greensburg, but is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, for the propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from the village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or a tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descended from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are the Sleepy Hollow boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say the place was bewitched by a high German doctor in the early days of the settlement. Others that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power, and a kind of a spell over this is a sort of a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subjects to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country. And the nightmare, with her ninefold, seems to make it the favorite place of her gambles. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certainly the most authentic historians of these parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning the specter, allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of the battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being elated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of these legendary of this legendary superstition that has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows. And the specter is known at all country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that this visionary propensity that I've mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they have been before they entered the sleepy region, they are sure in a little time to inhale the witching influences of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud because it is in such little retired Dutch valleys found here and there in bosoms of the great state of New York that population, manners, and custom remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweep by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw or the bubble riding quietly at anchor or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have passed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees and the same families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In this byplace of nature, there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years hence, a worthy wight by the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state that provides the Union with pioneers for the mind as well for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and county schoolmasters. The name of Crane was not inapplicable to this person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that could have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears and large green glassy eyes, and a long sniped nose so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or for some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building, one large room, rudely constructed of logs. The windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours with a twig twisted in the handle of the door and stakes set against the window shutters, so that though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out. An idea almost probably borrowed by the architect Joost van Houten from the mystery of an eel pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by, and a formidable birch tree growing at the one end of it. From hence, the low murmurs of his pupils' voices, conning over their lessons, might be heard on a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, in the tone of menace or command, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch, as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars were certainly not spoiled. When the school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would come convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue rising from his school was small. It would hardly have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to the country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. In these he lived successfully a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood, with all of his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. That all this might not be too onerous on the purses of his rustic patrons, who were apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burden, and schoolmasters as mere drones, he had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors on the farm, helped to make hay, mended the fences, took the horses to water, drove the cows from pasture, and cut wood for the winter fire. He lay aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absolute sway with which he lorded it in his little empire, the school, and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, and he would sit with a child on one knee and rock a cradle with his foot for whole hours on end. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folk in psalmody. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in front of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers, where, in his own mind, he completely carried away the palm from the pastor. Certain it was, his voice resounded far above all the rest of the congregation, and there were peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church, which may even be heard half a mile off, quite to the opposite end of the mill pond on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by diverse little makeshifts and that ingenious way which is commonly to be denominated by hook or by crook, the petty schoolmaster got on tolerably enough, and was thought, by all who understood nothing of the labor of head work, to have a wonderfully easy time of it. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to make some little stir at the tea table of a farmhouse, and the addition of an extra dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure among them in the churchyard, between services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior grace and address. From his half-itinerant life, also, he was kind of a traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers for digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover bordering the little brook that whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales, until the gathering dusk of the evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he was happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree toad, that harbinger of storm, the weary hooting of the screech owl, or the sudden rustling of a thicket of birds frightened in their roost. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, now and then startled him, as one of uncommon brightness would come by his path, and if, by a chance, a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging his blundering flight against him, the poor fellow was ready to give up the ghost with the idea he was struck with a witch's token. His only resource on such occasions, either to drown thought or to drive away evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by the doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing his nasal melody in sweetness long drawn out, floating from the distant hill or along the dusky road. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch housewives as they sit spinning by the fire and listen to the marvel tales of ghosts and goblins and haunted fields and haunted brooks and haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally in his anecdotes of witchcraft and of the direful omens and portentous sights and the sounds in the air which prevailed in the earlier times in Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn round, and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. But if there is a pleasure in all this, while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was already glow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no spectre dared to show his face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night. With what wistful look did he eye every trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window. How often was he appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path? How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulders, lest he should behold some uncouth being tramping close behind him? And how often was he thrown into complete disarray by some rushing blast, howling through the trees, and the idea that it was the Galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scurryings. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. And then, though he had seen many specters in his time, and had more than once beset Satan in diverse shapes in his lonely walks, yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in spite of the devil and all of his works, if he had not been crossed in his path by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together. And that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instruction was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty, but for her vast expectations. She was withal a bit of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as is most suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold that her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Sardab, the tempting stomacher of old times, and withal a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he'd visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, set either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those, everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it. And he prided himself upon the hearty abundance, rather than the style in which he lived. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those little sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. The great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a stream of the softest and sweetest water, in a little well formed of a barrel, and then stole sparkling away through the grass to a neighboring brook, which bubbled along among the alders and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn, which might have served for a church, and every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. The flail was busily resounding within it from morn to night. Swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves, and rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up as if watching the weather, some with their heads under their wings or buried in their bosoms, and others swelling and cooing and bowing about with their dames, were enjoying the sunshine on the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers were grunting in the repose and the abundance of their pens, whence sallied forth now and then a troop of suckling pigs, as if to snuff the air. A stately squadron of snowy geese were riding in an adjoining pond, enjoying whole fleets of ducks. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling about the farmyard. Guinea fowls were fretting about it like ill-tempered housewives, with their peevish, discontented cry. Before the barn door strutted a gallant rooster, that pattern of a husband, a warrior and a fine gentleman, clapping his burnished wings and crowing in the pride and gladness of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, and then generously calling his ever hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel he had discovered. Pedagog's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. The porpoise he saw carved out in the porpoise he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham, and not a turkey but he beheld daintily trussed up with its gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages. And even great Chanticleer himself lay sprawling on his back in a side dish with uplifted claws, as if craving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask while living. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, buckwheat, Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit which surrounded the warm tenant of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains. And his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingle palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children mounted on the top of a wagon filled with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath. And he held himself striding a pacing mare with a colt at her heels, and setting out for Kentucky or Tennessee or the Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with high ridge but low sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers, the low projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. From this piazza, the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion and the place of usual residence. Here, rows of resplendent pewter, ranging on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner, a huge bag of wool ready to be spun. In another, quantity of linsey woolsey just from the loom. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in gay festoons along the walls, mingled with the gourd of red peppers. And a door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs, the dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors, and irons with their company shovel and tongs glistened from the coverlet of asparagus tops. Mock oranges and conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored birds' eggs were suspended above it. A great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From the moment he laid his eyes upon these regions of the light, the peace of his mind was at an end. And his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. Ichabod had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments. And he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood, the rustic rural admirers, who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade, but of the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Bram van Blunt, a hero of the country around, which rang of his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair, and a bluff, but not unpleasant countenance, having a wrinkled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, and was as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and with the ascendancy which bodily strength acquires in rustic life, was the umpire of all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions with an air and tone admitting no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief in him than ill will. And with his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of good humor at bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the countryside, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles around. In cold weather, he was distinguished by a fur cap, surmounted with a flaunting foxtail. And when the folks at a country gathering described his well-known crest at a distance, whisking along with a squad of hard riders, they always stood by for a squall. Sometimes his crew could be dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight with whoop and halloo, like a troop of down Cossacks. And the old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurry-scurry clattered by, and then exclaim, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill. And when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caress and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is. His advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who had no inclination to cross the lion in his amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's paling on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or as it is termed, sparking within, all other suitors passed by in despair and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend. And considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supplejack, yielding but tough. Though bent, he never broke. And though he bowed with the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, he was erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness. But he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours, any more than that storming lover Achilles. Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character as singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Walt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter even better than his pipe. And like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her household and manage her poultry, for she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Walt would sit smoking in his evening pipe at the other. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter at the side of the spring under the great elm, or saunter along in the twilight, that hour so favorable to lovers' eloquence. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried his matters to open warfare, and would have settled their pretensions to the lady by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He'd heard the boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf in his own schoolhouse. And he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition, and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became an object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night, and in despite of its formidable fastenings of wife and window stakes, and turned the whole place topsy-turvy, so that the poor schoolmaster began to think that all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brown took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in the presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog which he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way, matters went on for some time, but without producing any material effect on the relative situation of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal day, Ichabod, in a pensive mood, sat enthroned in the lofty stool whence he watched all the concerns of his little literary domain. In his hand, he swayed a ferule, that scepter of despotic power, the birch of justice, reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons, detected on the persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop guns, whirligig, fly cages, and whole legions of rampant little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there's been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, as all the scholars were busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye kept upon the master. A kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the presence of a servant, a tow-cloth jacket and trousers, and a round fragment of a hat, like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope as by way of halter. He came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merry meeting or quilting frolic, to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. Now, all was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The scholars hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles, and those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity. And those who were tardy had a sharp application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed, to help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned. Benches overthrown, the whole school turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour on his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his best, indeed only suit of rusty black, arranges his looks by a bit of broken looking glass that hung up in the schoolhouse. That he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was staying, a choleric old Dutchman with the name of Hans Ripper, and thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight errant in quest of adventures. But it is meet that I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipment of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken down old plow horse, who had outlived almost everything but his viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with an ewe neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master's, who was a furious rider and had infused, very probably, some of his own spirit into the animal. For, old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly at his head like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for so his scanty strip of a forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hansman Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with in broad daylight. It was, as I said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, and while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet, streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air, and the bark of the squirrel could be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals could be heard from the neighboring stubble field. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in impressive opulence on the trees, others gathered in the baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Farther on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peering from their leafy coverts, and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding. and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered and garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was towards evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of the Heer Van Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a spare leathern-faced race in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames in close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats with scissors and pincushions, and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside. Buxom lasses, almost as antiquated in fashion as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock, gave symptoms of city innovation. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature, like himself, full of mettle and mischief, which no one but himself could manage. He was in fact noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all sorts of tricks, which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held an tractable, well-broken horse unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the raptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Not those of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped up platters of cakes of various and indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughy donut, the tender olie-koek, the crisp and crumbling crullers, sweet cakes and shortcakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. Then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mixed piddly, pretty much as I have enumerated them. And with the motherly teapot sending up its clouds of vapor from the mists. Heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, but did ample justice to every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back on the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans Van Ripper and every other niggardly patron, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out of doors who should dare to call him comrade. And now the sound of the music from the common room or hall summoned to the dance. The musician was an old gray-headed man who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of the time he scraped on two or three strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a motion of the head, bowing almost to the ground and stamping his foot whenever a fresh couple was to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle. And to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all of his amorous oglings, while Brown Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza and gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. The neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicles and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had, therefore, been the scene of marauding and infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and, in the indistinctness of his recollection, make himself the hero of every exploit. These were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in this part was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral processions, and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, which also stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was also made of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock. It was heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. Chief part of these stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which the decent whitewashed walls shine modestly forth, like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees, between which peeps may be caught of the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yards, where sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that at least the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, from which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, it was formerly thrown a wooden bridge, and the road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime. but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. It was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, and how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him, and how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brewer into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that, on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners, only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the flare of a pipe, sank deeply in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights that he had seen in his nightly walks around Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed in that interview, I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth, after no great interval, with an air quite desolate and chopfallen. Oh, these women! These women! Could the girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement to the poor pedagogue a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost, rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or the left to notice the scene of rural wealth, in which he had so often gloated, it went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most discourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he had been soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was a very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards along the sides of the lofty hills that rise above Tarrytown, in which he had traversed so cheerfully in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. All the stories and ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding back into his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky. The driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees in the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled, and fantastic, large enough to form trunks of ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Major Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by and was universally known as Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was just a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood lay bare. Suddenly, he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle. But it was the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served as a bridge over the stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of chestnuts and oaks, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. This was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, under the covert of those chestnuts and vines where the sturdy yeoman concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful of the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone in the dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up all of his resolution and gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of darting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. Schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel to the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, the plashy tramp was by the side of the bridge, caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, black, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed to be gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to fall upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly now was too late. And besides, what chance if there was an escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride on the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, Who are you? He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more, he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then, the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound, stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might be in some degree ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones of the Galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him, and he endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and mounted in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of the saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed, through thick and thin, stones flying, sparks flying at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed to be possessed with a demon, instead of keeping up it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow, shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in Godwin's story, and just beyond swells the green knoll upon which stands the whitewashed church. As yet the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder around the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and unskillful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on another, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him he was not mistaken. He saw the church walls dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recalled the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied he felt its hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast and looked behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner time came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the brook's banks, but there was no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after a diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. One part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle, trampled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the schoolmaster's body was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle that contained all of his worldly effects. It consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 stocks for the neck, a pair of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune telling, in which last a sheet of foolscap was found, much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor of the heiress of Van Tassel. These magic books and poetic scrawl were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans Van Ripper, who from that time forward determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good come of this same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his pay but a day or two before, he must have had about it on his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin were found. The stories of Brower and Bones, and a whole budget of others, were called to mind. And when they had diligently considered them all and compared them to the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was moved to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in his stead. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years later, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, and that he had left the neighborhood, partly through fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, and had kept school and studied law at the same time, and had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing when the story of Ichabod was related, which had always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judge in these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. And it is a favorite story told about the neighborhood around the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever a subject of superstitious awe. And that may be the reason why the road was altered in late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue. And the plowboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune during the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Now, there's a note here regarding our little story. This was one of the tales of our Mr. friend Dietrich Knickerbocker. One of the people to whom he was telling the story wanted to know what was the moral of the story. What was it meant to prove? Knickerbocker, who was just putting a glass of wine to his lips as refreshment after his toils, paused for a moment and looked at his inquirer with an air of infinite deference, and lowering the glass slowly to the table, observed that the story was intended most logically to prove there is no situation in life but has its advantages and pleasures, provided that we will but make a joke as we find it. That therefore he that runs races with goblin troopers is likely to have rough riding of it. Ergo, for a country schoolmaster to be refused the hand of a Dutch heiress is a certain step to high preferment in the state. Cautious old gentleman knit his brows tenfold closer at the explanation, being sorely puzzled by the morals here, and methought the one in the pepper and salt suit eyed him with something of a triumphant leer. At length he observed this was all very well, but still he thought the story was a little on the extravagant. There were one or two points of which he had his doubts. Safe, sir, said the storyteller. As for that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Hope you had a pleasant evening of it. And again, on behalf of Larchmont Library, Washington Irving, and myself, your friendly retired librarian, we wish you a pleasant night and a happy Halloween. Thank you.